Dr. Howard Eisenberg, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to address your listeners. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you here. We're going to be discussing your book, Dream It to Do It, The Science and Magic. But before we get in, and I have to say, I'm very impressed by the book.
Thank
I
you.
want to let listeners and viewers know that right off, that it's compactly written, given the scope of material that you're covering. It's a book all about consciousness, and it's pretty hard to condense a lot of good information about consciousness, but there's a lot of very factual information, and you kind of build an argument for the role of consciousness and everything. But before we get into all of that, I'd like to find out more about you, your background, how you got into all of this. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in Montreal.
Okay, you're Canadian, right?
Yes. I did live in the U.S., Vermont, for several years, but I am Canadian. Yes.
Yeah, and what was your family like? What did your parents do?
They were middle class, as we speak of those terms. It's also historic to talk of that these days. My father was an accountant. Both of them were not highly educated, and they were not intellectuals. They certainly wanted me to have a university education eventually to advance myself and have good prospects in life broadly, but they didn't have that background themselves.
Okay, well, I was wondering, maybe they were mental health professionals or something like that to kind of lay a little groundwork for your interests. Was either of them was there a spiritual orientation in the home?
Not really. I mean, in a sense, they were members of a conservative Jewish congregation because of my elderly grandparents. But in terms of their own personal faith or practice, no, not really.
Okay.
And there was no particular encouragement or discouragement for me to pursue the eventual interest I had in consciousness and reality and spirituality. Nor was there in my peer group. So very much it was something that came to me intuitively. To back to your earlier question, at a young age, around 11 or 12, I started becoming more awake to
What happened around 11 or 12? Did you have some kind of a spiritual experience or transpersonal experience?
The way I say, and I know sometimes the word awaken is used in different contexts, but in grade 5, while I was in primary school, I had a teacher, classroom teacher, who suddenly recognized an aptitude in me, which had not been recognized in previous teachers. And I had actually been scholastically a very poor performer until grade 5, just squeaking by. But somehow he recognized that I had an inner latent aptitude. He put a little more attention and focus on me in class and encouraged me to, so to speak, as I become awake in terms of my intellectual ability and curiosity and to have desire for achievement, to better myself.
Yeah.
And within 1 year, my scholastic achievement was so substantial that the school recognized me during the graduation ceremony, even though it wasn't my graduation ceremony at that point, grade 5. And they gave me an award as the most improved student in the entire school.
Yay.
So that was the beginning of an awareness in me of more potential. There's more to my life and the life perhaps in the outside world. I became very curious to start learning about the possibilities, and I turned at an early age, around 12 perhaps, to science fiction. I found the speculative science fiction very interesting.
Yeah, of course.
And at that point, still having the child mind, being open to possibilities, and I thought, like, why can't some of these things one day, actually become a reality?
Yeah.
And shortly after that, Russia launched the first Sputnik.
Right.
And I thought, like, wow, I'm reading about this stuff as pure speculation, not even by scientists, by fiction writers. And some of this is coming true. And over the years, I noticed a number of parallels with things I had read at one time at a very young age, let's say around 12, in science fiction, that were actually becoming factual in terms of our knowledge and our technology and our abilities.
And so what did you end up majoring in college?
Psychology.
Psychology.
I did an honors psychology program. I also did a master's psychology, experimental psychology. My thesis subject was in telepathy. And I did this also as a joint degree program with my medical degree. So I did the 2 degrees simultaneously, the medical degree and the research degree in psychology.
Wow, interesting. And so by telepathy, you mean mental telepathy, right?
I mean
Well,
that,
how
yes.
did you get into that? Had you read material suggest about
So
the research that was going on in parapsychology?
I'm glad to answer your questions and not just leave it to you to rein me in at times, because I can go, deep and broad here.
It's
So
okay.
back
We've got a fair amount of time here.
so back to my early science fiction readings. They
Yeah,
talked at that time about things like time travel and teleportation. It's got me
sure.
wondering. Now, of course, this is also pre-computer time. We're talking over a half century ago.
Yeah.
But somehow I discovered bookstores. And back then, paperbacks,
Right.
and that was my
Yeah.
treat, going in with a big,
Oh,
bar
yeah.
full of paperbacks.
Yeah.
And eventually I found, in looking at various paperbacks, something serious about such things like telepathy, time travel, and so on, precognition. And I found out about the work of Dr. J.B. Ryan in
Yeah.
Durham, North Carolina, who
Right.
was in many ways sort of the father figure for
Yeah.
parapsychology in the US and somewhat internationally.
Yeah.
And actually met him in my early 20s. I went
Oh,
down there
really? Wow.
to meet with him at one point.
Yeah. He's a figure I've only known through books.
Mhm.
Um,
So to cut back
wh-
to your question, so that was the root, still the science fiction,
yeah.
speculation. Then doing some just curious, serious reading to see if I could find something about that would lead me to someone again like the researcher Dr. Ryan. But around that time too, I always thought, from an early age, as I said to you, I've been working intuitively. And so I started getting curious about, can I do some of this stuff myself? Like, instead
Uh-huh.
of just contacting scientists or reading about it, if this is a possibility, can I maybe experience it, do it
Yeah.
myself? And so my first experiments that I remember were sitting in the back of streetcars and buses, and I'd focus on someone at the very front of the streetcar or bus.
Uh-huh.
And my experimental challenge was to see if I would just look towards them, concentrate with the intent that they would feel a presence and turn around and look directly at me,
Wow. Yeah.
and do this within a minute or two of time. It had to be very quickly.
Yeah.
And I found I could do that. And then I
Wow.
decided to up the ante. I made it more difficult. A young experimenter, thinking this
Yeah.
way. So
Right.
another condition. So the other condition was, so now I would only pick on somebody who was reading something. So they had to be absorbed in something, not just sitting there, perhaps free associating. And that worked too. And then I would only choose somebody who was in dialogue and conversation with someone beside them, like someone maybe deeply distracted, still could do it.
Wow.
So that was probably the first, time I actually tried myself
Uh-huh.
experimenting. Coming back to your question about telepathy.
Well, you did go on at some point to do graduate work in parapsychology at the University of Toronto.
No, that was at McGill, actually, at McGill.
Oh, that was at McGill. I don't
I
know
did
where I
have
picked that.
postgraduate studies at the University of Toronto in psychiatry, but the
Oh,
psychology research
I
was
got
McGill.
mixed up.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, tell us about that program. Was that sort of a self-designed PhD?
You're going to love the answer to that question too.
Yeah.
So I knew that the chairman of the psychology department at McGill at that time was the famous D.O. Hebb. He's the one,
Yes.
historically, who came up with the notion, cells that fire together, wire together, like sort of in some ways the father of neuroplasticity today. But I also knew that he was an outspoken skeptic of anything parapsychological, psychic, supernatural,
Uh-huh.
spiritual. In fact, he had actually stated so in print in one of the APA journals a number of years
Yeah.
ago, which I cite in my book, Treatment to Do It. And I thought it would be a good challenge for me to take on someone like that who was saying in advance, I reject all of it a priori. He didn't say the evidence is insufficient. He said he rejects it a priori because it's impossible with his understanding of reality. That's what he said back then. So it doesn't matter
Yeah.
what your evidence was. So I
Right.
thought it would be quite an achievement for me in my personal growth if I would take on a challenger like that, who said, like, no matter what you do, I won't accept it.
This
The second
is
thing,
kind of like being in the streetcar and getting people to turn around.
yes,
So
I
you
like
raise
challenge.
you
I like
raise the
challenges.
bar.
Yeah, I like challenges, right? I still do.
Yeah,
Even with this book, for example,
yeah.
coming back to its purpose, which we may get to later on. So I decided I would do the research there. My hope in the bigger scheme of things was by doing it there in the lion's den, that it would,
Yes.
really be a breakthrough for the whole field of parapsychology for other researchers to have more of a foothold of legitimacy
Yeah.
in higher institutions. Um, didn't quite happen that way. I did convince the university to allow me to do this research, but I had to go through some interesting hurdles to do that, back to, guided intuitively. So when I went to the university and I said I'd like these 2 degrees simultaneously, they weren't at that point interested in what my field of research was, just the notion I wanted them together. So you can't do it together. I said, why not? Because no one's ever done it before. I said, so why is that a reason for me not to be able to do it? Aren't we supposed to be
Yeah.
the leading center, of knowledge?
Right.
And they said, well, there's practical problems. I said, like what? They said, well, for example, every student in this university has a computer ID number. You'd be in 2 different faculties, faculty of medicine and faculty of graduate studies at the same time. The computers don't know how to process that. And I said, are the computers here to help us? Or are we supposed to fit into their templates?
That's
Then he said, well,
still
there's a
an
very
ongoing
even,
question.
yeah. And
Yeah.
then they came back with another even very basic question.
Yeah.
They said, well, if you do 2 degrees at once, you're not exactly going to be using all our facilities like doubly, like 200%, because you'll still be here for the library and so on. We wouldn't know how to calculate your tuition. I said, I'm not asking for a discount. They finally gave me the green light and allowed me to do it. So back to your
Okay.
question, no, it was
Fascinating.
not a program that, pre-existed, or even a program. I had to create it.
Now,
And with some real obstacles. It wasn't encouraged again.
yeah. So you were in the medical school. This was when
At
you were
McGill.
working on getting your MD.
That's right.
So both the MD study and now parapsychological study.
For
So
my
my
master's
next,
of psychology.
yeah. So my next question is, did you do actual research, or was it more of a literature review kind of thing that
No,
you set up for
absolutely.
yourself?
It was research.
Okay, well, tell us
I
about
knew
that.
I knew from the literature that had been published by other researchers that when people had psychic experiences, most of the time it involves some type of emotional stimuli.
Right.
Sometimes, for example, a crisis. Someone might be in
Yes.
life and death crisis of some sort in
Right.
danger. And people could sense it, supposedly, at some distance, or a premonition about a coming danger. But often it was related to something, I say, pretty emotional, and often in a self-protective way. So I decided to try to create a form of controlled stimulation, which would predictably cause some emotional experience for people watching it. And that was to use specially edited motion picture films back then. And I chose a number. One of them, for example, coming back to strong emotion, was from the Boston Strangler movie.
Okay.
So, and I
Yeah.
specially edited these as well to make them even more enhanced, more dramatic,
Yeah.
for positive or negative affect. So that was the stimulation I was working with. And then I also knew from the literature that when people are picking up psychic information, parapsychological information, so to speak, usually they're in a kind of a free associative state of mind. So I had their partners in another floor of a concrete building without any windows and locked doors, lying down on a mat comfortably. The light was closed in the room. There was an experiment outside the room and the locked doors, so no one could convey any information one way or another. The experimenter outside the room with the recipient lying down also didn't know what the stimulation would be that day for that trial. And afterwards, what I had the subjects do was they'd be awakened at a certain point. We determined the coordinate, the schedule time-wise, and they would be asked to free associate, write down immediately, what were you experiencing in those several minutes when you were lying down in the dark? Then they were also given 5 photographs. One photograph was actually from the actual movie clip that their partner was being shown, the so-called sender, if you like. The others were chosen to be comparable visually, but had nothing to do with the actual movie film clip. So in other words, similar quality, similar size. There was nothing,
Mhm.
if you would just look at a series of them
Yeah.
randomly to suggest
Yeah.
one would be more attractive or more likely to be the movie or used in this experiment. So we did two separate measures to make it really brief. One was to look at whether the free association comments really were rich in detail of what visually the sender, so to speak, watching the film was actually being presented with. The second one was we also had the sender, after they had the experience of watching the movie clip, take the same deck of 5 photographs, duplicate set, and do the same thing, rank order them in terms of how closely it approximated their experience subjectively during the movie. Because you could show someone, for example, let's say a clip of a football game, and some people might choose something, let's say, warlike, because they think of, a physical confrontation.
Right.
Someone may choose something suggesting food like popcorn or hot dogs. So just because we have the same objective stimulus doesn't mean subjectively it has the same associations or affect. So this is a way of capturing that as well. Then I did a rank order correlation between the two decks of photographs and found that also positively correlated. So, and I had a number of other measures too. So it was
Yeah.
very, very powerful evidence for these.
Let me ask you a couple of methodological questions here. You said they were partners. Were they randomly assigned to
Yes,
sender
they
and
were randomly
receiver,
assigned.
or were they marital partners?
No,
or,
they were randomly assigned.
Randomly assigned. The other thing I want to ask you is, I noticed that that the prologue, that's not the right word, the introduction to your book, yeah, was written by Stanley Krippner. Now, Stanley Krippner, to my mind, is like the one of the, certainly for a long time, the foremost person in parapsychology. And I was in graduate school at the University of Michigan when probably towards the end of my study there. And I have to say, psychology, Hebb was no exception in terms of his.
Oh, I know, but he was extreme.
His skepticism, because most, and particularly experimental psychologists, but even clinical psychologists and so on, psychology for a long time had this physics envy problem. And so if they couldn't fit it into the natural paradigm of what we understood from physics and so on, then it couldn't be. And then Stanley Krippner, who did some, I think one of my peers referred me to, say, hey, there's this guy, Stanley Krippner, who's, proving ESP. So I looked into it, and that was enough to open me up to be more open to the idea. And then later to meet Stanley Krippner and get to know him some. So to what extent were you aware at that time of Stanley Krippner's research? And was that one of the things that was
yes,
shaping your research?
I was aware of his research on dream telepathy of Maimonides.
Yes.
Which partly gave me, the notion of using an affect stimulation. So in part, it triggered, the creative association of doing my variation of it. And I also became interested to personally connect with Stanley. And as with J.B. Ryan, I sought him out almost a half a century ago. And over the years, I met him a number of times. And he's one of the people I have the highest respect for, both in the field of parapsychology and science more broadly, and even as a man. I'm so impressed by his modesty with all his accomplishments.
I know. Yeah.
Wow. And he's so modest. Wonderful.
And
role model that way.
He walks a careful line as a scientist, because everybody wants it. A lot of people would like to tear him down, and so he carries himself to be as impeccable as possible from a scientific point of view, intellectual point of view. And
he really is. I mean, when we have our own private conversations.
Oh yeah.
He's impeccable. It's rigorous.
Yeah, he's very rigorous, and at the same time, he's interviewed and studied all kinds of people that just seem to be so far out. And I once asked him about that. I was intrigued by his answer. He said, I study much, but I'm not necessarily believing at all. And so I was interested in that line that he walks.
He's a scientist.
But,
I never thought of him as someone who's just a true believer and trying to validate his faith.
Yeah.
He's a scientist.
Yeah.
In the true sense of the word.
Well, I'm glad that we have that background, because in my mind, it helps to validate your work. And so that was the research that you did. And did you have any difficulty getting it accepted by, I assume you had a doctoral committee, maybe D.O. Heb and some other random faculty who were maybe somewhat skeptical about what you were up to?
So the good news is, once I got the clearance to be able to do this dual degree and approval from the psychology department to have the subject matter for my thesis be in parapsychology and telepathy specifically, once I had that clearance, which took some work, as I explained, I had no problem at the end point. But also I had chosen one of the members of my thesis committee who was another hard-nosed skeptic about the impossibility of such things. And he was a statistician expert as well.
Okay.
So I wanted someone, if there was any hole in my statistic methodologies, and I had a number of different statistical measures. So it wasn't just depending on one or two. There were multiple ones.
Yeah.
They were all correlated very strongly. And he said to me at the end of it, he didn't try and stop, going through, but he just said to me, he said, I'd rather reject the validity of statistics than accept the implications of your research. But he did nothing to try and stop it because he could find no flaw.
Yeah. Wow. That's a great quote.
I was there at a very interesting time, which again, I describe in my book anecdotally. It was Heb's secretary who was the one in the department who was assigned to type up my thesis. And so I was in her office one day, just doing some final proofreading corrections. And Dr. Heb walked out of an adjacent office. And she, at that point, had understood the whole research. We were just doing some fine, tuning on the, as a typographical corrections. And so she called out to him, and she said, Professor Heb, you were wrong. ESP is real. This research proves it. So that was a very momentous, time. And it took a while.
I didn't quite understand that. What did she say?
She said, Professor Heb, you were wrong. ESP is real. This research proves it. And that's what turned his thinking. And shortly afterwards, he started talking publicly that he's willing to accept the existence, at least, of short distance telepathy.
Yeah.
And then later on, as I quote in my book, it was much more open-ended. He didn't put any limits on it.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that's a real achievement, I must say. And so let's kind of go through the book, and I'll we don't have time to go to get as deep into the book as you do in the book, but to have you maybe walk you through your chapters and have you respond to it.
Sure.
And I'm wondering, but to jump ahead a little bit, did your findings that you had draw you to any spiritual practices, to readings in Eastern or Western mysticism, etc.? Yeah, tell us about that. How it's impacted you as a person.
Well, I was very interested once I became aware to learn, and my interest was broad. So even in my late adolescence, early teens, I was already starting to read books about physics and mysticism and a little bit about comparative religions, the Oriental religions, for example, out of curiosity, intellectually. All of the time I had this interest and also starting to do my actual research. And I also went on eventually to teach parapsychology as a credit course at the University of Toronto. But during all of that period, I very much was still working as a scientist under the materialist reductionist paradigm of reality, with the assumption that ultimately we could explain everything in material terms. That although these were things we couldn't explain in terms of what was known about brain function, one day we could eventually be able to describe and explain it. Maybe there's some other type of electromagnetic radiation, a different type of
Right.
radiation,
Right.
whatever. And it wasn't until about 3 years ago
How
when I
many?
was in 3 years ago,
3 years ago. Okay.
when I was invited to present a keynote presentation for the annual meeting of an association of healers who do therapeutic touch, laying on of hands, so to speak, that I felt a reason for all the other things I was doing at that time to go deeply back into the literature of parapsychology and see what, if anything, had been further elucidated over the last 3 decades. But the same thing with modern quantum mechanics. I did a very deep dive. Like, what have we learned to understand the cosmological workings of, the universe? And did a deeper dive into comparative religions. Started getting back also into some so-called wisdom traditions and some of the indigenous teachings. Also, though, factoring in the latest research in neuroplasticity and on psychedelic research
Yeah.
that was going on recently, getting a little more exciting in that area. So a lot of different diverse areas suddenly doing a very, very deep, dive, data dump. And suddenly, to my surprise, didn't expect this, I suddenly experienced a 180 degree shift in my understanding. Some might call this an insight or a revelation. But I suddenly understood in a very fundamental way a number of things. That one, our whole sense of what is real and reality is totally wrong. But secondly, that the particular reason that parapsychology was having so much difficulty being accepted, why it was so hard on demand to produce laboratory results and have them replicated, was not because it wasn't real phenomena. It was more like we were just trying to capture shadows without realizing it. We weren't actually trying even to get the original source of such phenomena. And that source wasn't physical, and it wasn't out there. It was internal, from a level of consciousness that we're all part of and draw from. I suddenly realized that there was more evidence in support of what we now call the primacy of consciousness than there was for the existence of an independent material reality. And
Right.
as you know, I went very deep into various chapters, like even the one on
Yeah.
physics, and showing that even the physicists are saying the same thing, that the notion many of us still have, not just in psychology, but broadly, of what is reality and what is physical solidity.
Yeah.
Totally wrong. Not partly, it's totally wrong.
Yeah.
So suddenly I realized that the materialist reductionist paradigm of reality, which has been with us since Democritus in ancient Greece, it just got more and more elaborate as we got more and more into our technological developments. It's a metaphysical fiction. It was a matter just we believed it, we bought into it. But there's no proof for it. The proof is for the primacy of consciousness. So in my book, what I try to do is provide, as you said, it's deep, there's a lot of information in a deceptively small book, exhaustive, comprehensive information from many different facets that when you connect those dots, lead to this as a conclusion, not as a hypothesis, and connecting it all in a logical way too. So I think my book, as I understand it, and you're welcome to, come back at me if you think there's any holes in it, it proves the primacy of consciousness. It's not just proposing the case for it, it proves it. And with that, more radically, when you ask me about spiritual backgrounds, it leads us to an understanding of what historically, in various ways, we've referred to as God, as a creator, not of the same level of which we are, but from which we have come. Except that historically, in most religions and currently, it's a matter of faith. You're told to believe what you were born into in your family or by the religious teachers dominant in your community. But this is not about faith. This is about knowing.
I really don't have anything terribly skeptical to confront you with, but I know one of the things that opened me up to that kind of awareness for short periods of time. It's hard to stay in that place for me. was psychedelic drugs, psychedelics in the 60s while I was in graduate school. And, but one of the parapsychologists in that period, in the modern period of the 60s or 70s, and I'm always blocking on his name, but he brought forth a concept that I've found very, very interesting called repression of the sublime. And just as we have the tendency to repress things that are horrible, it was his contention that it's hard for us to admit these things that are going the other direction, that are, you know, in the God direction, and that we may, some of us may break through that repression or may touch it, but then because of this repression of the sublime, and I think that's what happens to me, to own it.
You know, in my book, I say we're amphibious beings. So we exist in this level of reality where we're individual bodies and egos and personalities in different locations. And this is part of our reality. But to me, as I understand it, it's only one part of our reality, one level of our reality. At another level, we're not separate beings and we're not in separate places. It's all coming out of the same, so to speak, field.
And more people are saying this. It's not as radical a proposition in psychology as it was at one time. There are a number of psychologists and psychiatrists who are,
it's time. It's way overdue. I look at the world going massively insane right now. It's time they realize maybe there's something wrong with their paradigms. But come back, Jules Eisenberg decades ago, who's a psychiatrist, he coined the term psi resistance. PSI, psi, is the abbreviated term for all types of psychic phenomena. And he thought it was at a subconscious level that we actually had this filtering to deny it.
Yes, that's the same idea.
Alan Watts, as I describe in my books, came up with this interesting metaphor, that why do we have this world created, so to speak, by God? Why would, if there was a God who knew everything, had absolute power, why would that God then want to create us and this world? And he used the analogy of, like, when we're bored, we daydream, because our mind wants to be aware of something, and arguably you can't really be conscious unless you are aware of something. That's probably how we define consciousness, as awareness of being aware, but it has to be of something that you're aware of. So arguably, in a sense, the model he works with is that, in a way, what we call God or the creator, the universal mind is a more neutral term, dreams us up for its own fuller expression of greater awareness through us as proxies, just like when we ourselves have dreams. And in our own dreams, for a while, we lose sense that we're just dreaming, and we have other people we're interacting with, other places physically perhaps we're visiting, and so on. But it's all just coming out of our imagination. Now, Dr. Alan Watts, coming back to this, also thought, though, that there was a fail-safe, that for this to work well, God, so to speak, or the universal mind, had to sort of forget that it's generating these other manifestations, these other entities, these other relationships, these other experiences. So it may be intrinsic that there's a part of us that sort of blocks this awareness of this fuller connection, so that we can also be out here living and providing, again, a richer experience for the universal mind's consciousness, awareness.
I'm struck that it's 3 years ago. I mean, I feel lucky to get you so close to the point where you had this profound shift, and only 3 years ago. And I take it that was not a result of psychedelics?
No, it was really an incredibly deep data dump. And because you've seen the book, you know which data I'm working with. So when I say deep, it was really, really deep, and in many, many different fields. And I'll tell you also that when I first had this insight, because it came quickly, finally, it wasn't welcomed emotionally. it was like, oh gosh, like if this is like real, I'm all alone. Like all of these people don't really exist, and these things and so on, my possessions or whatever doesn't
yeah,
exist. I'm all alone. And then suddenly, fortunately, I realized, no, it's not that I'm all alone. I'm connected to everything and everyone.
yeah.
It's the opposite. But at first, the first reaction was,
Wow.
no, I
Yeah,
don't like this, their
that's
understanding of
fascinating.
reality.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so, the first chapter of your book
Mhm,
is Things Are Not As They Seem, and you've
mhm,
kind of taken us through that. And I like the section that you have in the third chapter, the real basis of scientific discovery and invention, because I've often thought about that myself, that it's the model that we're taught of
mhm,
science in graduate school is that a very objective person who calls himself a scientist objectively
mhm,
tests a hypothesis, which he then very sanely accepts or rejects. But if
mhm,
we look at how people are really wired, and what really
mhm,
happens is
mhm,
uh, when psychologists or other kinds of scientists get a hypothesis,
mhm,
they're very reluctant to let go of the hypothesis.
mhm, mhm. That's
They
right.
often, it's from an intuitive place
Mhm,
that they have this strong conviction. Wait, this is the way it is.
mhm.
So I think that a lot of what we think of as objective science really comes from a very deep subjective place, which is
Yeah,
what you're
and
saying.
confirmation bias. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I used to wonder how they could talk about the science of yoga. But
Mhm,
actually, if you go into meditation, if you go into looking inwardly
mhm, mhm,
with an open mind, and it seems like what we think of as outer can also
mhm.
be arrived at in a very inner way,
Yeah, I use
if that
also the
makes
example of
sense.
the Mobius strip, where
Yeah,
they're the same. It's just another perspective of the in and the out.
yeah, yeah.
They're not really separate surfaces and different.
What else do we want to say in the time that remains? Is
Well,
Have you
you
got to
might
say
you might be
everything that you
interested.
want to say? Or
You might be interested in, first of
yeah,
all, so why did I write this book? So yes, I had this insight or understanding or revelation, but nevertheless, why write up as a book, especially in the middle of a pandemic experience, which
yeah,
is stressing us all in various ways. I felt called once I had that insight, David. I felt called. I only I heard a voice, but I just felt I have to share this with the world. And I
yeah,
don't mean when I say that my academic world, or more even, in a more focused way, my, let's say, colleagues in parapsychology or psychology. I meant the world. Um, when I said I had that insight that our sense of an outer independent existing physical reality is totally wrong, and it's a metaphysical fiction, it's a superstition, if you like, and that we're really forgetting the real essence of our reality, who we are, who we can be, what we can do differently.
hmm,
When I look at what's happening in the world, aside from the science of this and philosophical understandings, we're witnessing, all of us right now in this dimension, the collapse of the materialistic reduction paradigm of reality, not because of scientific discoveries, not because of logic, which is what my book's about, but because of just, it's so obvious. It's all breaking down now.
yeah, yeah,
We're having societal, civilizational collapse in many respects, and I won't go into the laundry list, but we both know what I'm talking about in that
sure,
respect.
yeah,
The global climate change is already happening. It's
yeah,
not something that just maybe will happen. It is happening.
yeah.
Uh, the pandemic of COVID-19 we're going through right now has not left us. Many people are done with it. The virus is not done with us.
I
This is one of the most
happen to agree
rapidly
with you.
mutating
Yeah,
viruses in history.
Yeah.
And when you think of a virus, you think of something kind of dumb. It's just a little, fragment of
Right.
genetic information. But if you look at it collectively, it's a mutating intelligence.
Yeah.
And humans are failing the IQ test in dealing with that virus.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, so in so many ways,
Yeah.
again, as I said, our understanding of what is real, what is important, how material reality works, it's breaking down now, big time.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking of Al Gore's title for his film, An Uncomfortable Truth.
Yeah, inconvenient
And
truth, I think it was.
and
Yeah.
and you've been visited with, as we all have, with an uncomfortable truth. And I can understand your hesitation to put that out there on the one hand, and on the other, your sense of a call. I mean, hey folks, wake up. If there's anything we can do, it's time to do it. Yeah.
And similarly to, if we go back to that model of the universal mind, God consciousness dreams us up for a greater expansion of its own awareness, consciousness. I'd still come back to, if I could, the analogy with the human model, as we understand ourselves as humans, when we go to sleep and we have a dream experience. Sometimes our dreams are enjoyable and we welcome them. But once in a while, especially when we're young, we have negative dreams, nightmares. Some of them are like night terrors and would totally freak some people out, even as adults. I have some patients now, just when I was talking to earlier today, who has unfortunately experienced as an adult being attacked, and it keeps coming up in his dreams, and it scares him immensely. I don't think the universal consciousness, the God consciousness, and it's very difficult working with these words, as you appreciate, because they're applied in a different way.
Sure.
So I can only use them kind of symbolically, but then the map is not the territory anyway. We take words literally sometimes too much. I don't think the God consciousness wants this turmoil and pain and destruction in this world. And I think if we understand our true nature, that we're all coming from the same source, we're all in some ways one. And if we come back to caring for each other compassionately and collaborating with each other, working together with each other, I think there's enough of a window of opportunity, but it's a very small one, to really turn things around and save ourselves, save our civilization, save our planet, and have a better life quality globally than we've ever perhaps had before. But that window, is so narrow now. We don't have much time. It's only a few years at most.
Yes. Yeah. You mentioned patients, and I was forgetting that you're a practicing psychiatrist.
Psychotherapist. I'm a sort of hybrid because I have the psychology degree and I have a medical degree, and I did have psychiatric training, but I'm really a hybrid. I call myself a medical psychologist or medical psychotherapist. And I'm still practicing, yes.
So this must be a hard time. I mean, given what you've just said, I was trained to be a therapist, but I haven't practiced in years and years. It must be a hard time to practice holding this vision.
It's a hard time to practice, and as you may know, there's a very high burnout rate right now in the healthcare, profession broadly. And the mental health care needs, because of the pandemic and other things going on that are upsetting and making people feel more insecure, are also, incredibly high. So there's a real mismatch. And the people I'm working with are definitely more needier, let's say, if they had anxiety or depression, than they would have been pre-pandemic times. So it's very draining. But on the other hand, what I've discovered, what I understand, what I'm able now to teach, can give people really hope. It's like the ultimate personal empowerment manual. Like how do you really make sense and suddenly not just let life happen to you, but start being in a position of some choice of power of how you want it to happen for you and for others.
So how does this express itself in the work that you do with others?
Well, as you may know, coming back to the psychotherapy area particularly, so much of what torments, bothers, holds people back is either about what happened to them or didn't happen to them, or what they need to happen or they think is going to happen to them. but it's not about what's going on right now.
Right now, yeah.
And, and that's just also an ancient spiritual practice, just center in the present moment, in the here and now. If you're really in the here and now, anchored, rooted, as I say to some patients, it's almost impossible to feel the weight of depression because that's about past stuff. And if you're really anchored in the here and now, it's almost impossible to feel anxiety, worry, because that's only about a possible future. It isn't now. So when you're in the now, I call it your point of power. It's very powerful to understand it, both conceptually, but also then learn experientially how to do it on demand.
Right.
And there are a number of ways. Many people have heard of, and it's more popular these days, meditation. But it's not the type of thing you can just do on demand and, it just clears your mind. But there are things you can do on demand. One is what I call sensory grounding. So wherever you are, if you're really in a bad experiential state, becoming very aware of the physicality of your relationship to your immediate physical environment. So for example, I'm sitting in a chair, as I think you are right now. So if you're sitting in a chair, you suddenly feel yourself being supported by the chair, below and perhaps behind and maybe arms, as well. If you're standing, you feel a solid surface under your feet. You look in your immediate environment at what's around you right now. And perhaps listen to any sounds in your immediate environment right now.
Right.
So
Yeah.
again, you're grounding yourself, you're anchoring yourself, you're stabilizing yourself. And then I also work with things like diaphragmatic breathing. When I teach patients to breathe a little more deeply, to change the ratio of inhalation and exhalation. So exhalation is about twice as long in duration as the inhalation ratio, So the inhalation is half as long as the exhalation. So for example, if I said count to 3 as you inhale in your mind, 1, 2, 3, I teach them exhalation would be double that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So by breathing more deeply, by changing the ratio, they're activating their vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the largest nerve in the human body. Unlike most nerves, the vagus nerve is a two-way street. It doesn't just go one way, like a motor control or sensory information. It can go both ways. And the vagus is able to change the entire brain state within just moments. In fact, it's the fastest way to downregulate the nervous system. So back to your question, I'm just giving examples, obviously. So I teach them, still working with brain. It's not that I'm saying brain doesn't exist. It's just that I'm saying brain is not the source of consciousness, but it modulates, and you can learn to change the modulation. So that's one example.
Yeah. Well, this could be a good place for us to wrap it up, I think. We've gone the full circle.
Thank you.
Yeah. So so if people want to find out more about you, do you have a website or
I do.
something that you'd like to tell people about on, how to follow up,
Yeah.
aside from buying your book?
Yeah, the best way to get general information about me would be through my website, which is www.drhowardeisenberg.com. I'm also fairly active on LinkedIn.
Okay, great. Dr. Howard Eisenberg, I want to thank you for being my guest today
Thank you,
on
David.
Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity.